The Construction of the Subway and the Plan for the City of Moscow by L.M. KAGANOVICH. Speech delivered at the plenum of the Moscow Soviet, attended by the shock brigadiers of Metrostroy, the subway construction, and the factories of Moscow, July 16, 1934. 1. Difficulties and successes in the struggle for the subway. Comrades, 6 months of struggle for the practical realization of the January decision, quote, on the tempo of the construction of the first section of the subway, unquote, have now passed. This half year has shown what great difficulties we have to overcome in the course of the construction of the subway. It has also shown what workers, what Bolsheviks are able to do when they tackle a job in earnest, when they mobilize the masses and when they lead them correctly, supporting, encouraging and criticizing as is done by our Leninist Central Committee of the party and Comrade Stalin, the greater builder of our country and of its capital, our Red Moscow. In this period, we have had to overcome a series of obstacles and difficulties. We have had to recruit many thousands of workers for work on the subway. Almost all the Moscow enterprises selected their best workers, particularly young Communist League members, to take part in building the first Moscow subway. The workers selected are splendid men and women, the thousands of enthusiastic shock brigaders who have been forged from among them are the best proof of this. But enthusiasm alone is not enough for work on the subway. What we need is experience, a mastery of the technique of this work. An overwhelming majority of the workers recruited were not only entirely unfamiliar with the building of subways, it is understood that none of us had previously had any experience in this kind of construction, but they were also unfamiliar with the jobs of excavation, pouring and reinforcing concrete, and other tasks. Textile workers, chemical workers, municipal workers, metal workers and collective farmers had to speedily qualify themselves as builders. Much work was needed to teach the subway builders correct methods of subway construction. In this the Bolshevik and Young Communist League enthusiasm of the workers helped, thanks to which it was possible in a comparatively short time to weld together a fighting collective of the Metrostroy shock brigaders. However, comrades, we must not get swell-headed, for there are still plenty of defects in our work. There are very many who are still behind in mastering the technique, who have not learned the job to which they were assigned. In the early stages, we have had to overcome the hesitation of the engineering personnel in making responsible decisions, in firmly directing the work in their respective sections. Only in the process of work was it possible to remove those who failed to justify the hopes placed in them and to select the best engineers and technicians, those with skill, energy and initiative, and as a result there are hundreds of exemplary commanders among the engineers and technicians of Metrostroy, besides thousands of splendid worker shock brigaders. It was necessary to overcome sluggishness, organizational confusion, bureaucratic desk leadership, weakness in operative command in the Metrostroy administration itself. It became necessary to draw the administration closer to the shaft, to the section, to strengthen the importance, the rights and the independence of the lower units of the construction. It was necessary to introduce mechanization, overcoming at times opposition to mechanization processes due to incapacity and unwillingness to master the mechanisms and to use them to their full capacity. We encountered a series of most complicated technical problems, which we have solved successfully. The construction of a subway is a most difficult job, much more complicated than the construction of any factory. In spite of the difficulties encountered in digging a subway under conditions where the subsoil is full of streams and quicksands intersecting the subway line, the construction of the subway has been accompanied by a comparatively insignificant number of accidents and cave-ins. The Moscow Party Committee and the Presidium of the Moscow Soviet demanded of the Metrostroy workers technical cleanliness, efficiency and accuracy in their work. We have often been told, "Don't you know that in every city in the world where subways have been built there have been accidents, that houses and buildings have collapsed, and yet you want to build a subway without any accidents?" To this we replied that we may also have some cave-ins and cracks in houses, but we demanded that our work be done in the most careful way, so that there will be a minimum of cave-ins and cracks, and to assure this, we must take every precaution to avoid accidents and cave-ins. It was just this that was repeatedly demanded of us by the Central Committee and by Comrade Stalin personally. The Moscow Party Committee and the Moscow Soviet have repeatedly had to work out plans of detailed measures to overcome difficulties in construction which arose at different sections of the work, as, for example, in the Kofferdam section of the Komsomol Square, in the Okhotny Row, on the Dzerzhinsky Square, and elsewhere. Thus, for example, in the beginning of this year, we received information about the subsidences of the streets, or, to use technical language, movements of the subsoil in the tunnels of the Dzerzhinsky Square station, the Myasnitsky station, and the Krasnye Voroda station. We met and thrashed out this question with the workers of Metrostroy. You, comrades, know, of course, that we are not engineers, and that we don't know much about the movements of subsoils. Until now, we knew different movements, the workers' revolutionary movement and the counter-revolutionary movement, but now we were confronted with the movement of subsoil. Laughter in the audience. We had to study the causes and the ways and means of stopping this movement of the ground. After a thorough study of the question, precautionary measures were taken, wooden supports were replaced by concrete and metal ones, the level of the station was lowered 2.17 meters, we carried on work in small sections and rapidly reinforced them with concrete. We mobilized all our forces, assigned our most competent men to the tunnel work, which continues to progress steadily without any damage to the square or the houses on it. We met a series of difficulties also in other sections, where we had to hasten the hardening of the concrete, to rush the cofferdams, to build the best supports, overcoming the difficult conditions prevailing in subway excavation through the Moscow subsoil. However, despite these difficulties, we have recently attained an exceptionally rapid tempo in the construction of the subway. The work accomplished so far can be divided into 3 stages. The first stage, from the end of 1931 through all of 1932, was the stage of preparation and organization. The second stage, the year 1933, marked the actual commencement of the construction. The third stage, the year 1934, marks redoubled efforts in all sections. In November 1931, during the first stage, we started an experimental section and carried out much preparatory work, the geological survey and planning, recruiting of labor, organization. This was also a period of discussion and debates on the best methods of digging tunnels, sinking shafts, and so on. During the second stage, work started on sinking shafts in the Myasnitsky radius. Construction work began in 4 other sections, and preparatory work in 5, while the shafts in the Arbat radius were only in the process of preparation. Only during the third stage was work actually started at a proper tempo and in all the sections. Only in January 1934 did we rapidly increase the tempo of excavation and concrete work. Only in January did we begin to sink shafts in the Arbat radius, and with increased efforts to proceed with this work. Permit me to bring to your attention a short table of figures showing the amount of work accomplished during all 3 stages of construction. Operation: earth excavation in cubic kilometers. Total volume of work: 2,055,000. Work completed: first stage, end of 1931 and all 1932, 14,000 cubic kilometers. Percentage to total volume: 0.7. Second stage, 1933, 300,000 cubic kilometers. Percentage to total volume: 14.6%. Third stage, 1934 up to July 16th, 1,326,000 cubic kilometers excavated, which is 64.6% of the total. Work remaining: 415,000 cubic kilometers, or 20.1%. Concrete pouring in cubic meters. Total volume of the work: 700,000. First stage: 2,000 cubic meters, or 0.3%. Second stage: 60,000 cubic meters, or 8.6%. Third stage: 413,000, or 59%. Work remaining: 225,000 cubic meters, or 32%. Finished tunneling in linear meters. Total volume of the work, 11,900 meters. During the first stage, this wasn't started yet. In the second stage, 631 meters, or 5.3%. Third stage, 5,337 meters, or 44.8%. Work remaining, 5,932 meters, which is 49.9%. Permit me to demonstrate with the following chart the rise in the tempo of excavation and concrete work since January 1934. Side by side with the steady growth of excavation and concrete work, this chart also reveals how the work of pouring concrete is lagging behind the excavation work. In order to increase the tempo in pouring concrete, we had to eliminate a number of defects. In the first place, the long delays. The organization of labor and the distribution of the workers on the different sections of the work was bad. There was a shortage of transport facilities for removing the earth, for the supply of materials, and so on. As is seen from the given figures, we have made in the past half a year a gigantic stride in the work of tunneling the subway. In order to appreciate the importance of this half year, it is sufficient to indicate that if we had continued to work at the same rate as in December 1933, 1,800 cubic meters of excavation and 456 cubic meters of concrete pouring a day, then the tunnel work as far as the removal of earth is concerned would have been completed in 32 months, and as regards the pouring of concrete in 46 months, that is, by December 1937. Now, however, we shall complete the basic work of the tunneling in November 1934, and shall open the subway in January, or at the very latest in February 1935. A picture of the chart will be on the screen right now. So you see, comrades, even in the face of the natural difficulties encountered, we have allowed for a delay altogether of 3 months in the opening of the subway, and we are utilizing this time to the utmost in order to fulfill the instructions of the Central Committee and of Comrade Stalin personally to improve the quality of the work and to be best prepared for the opening of the subway. And so, if we reckon the end of 1931 as the commencement of actual construction, which is very conditional, in reality it was 1933 when construction really began, then in 3.5 years we will have built 11.9 kilometers of subway line under conditions where the subsoil presented exceptional difficulties, where many workers were unqualified for such a job, where the engineering and technical personnel were inexperienced, and where in many sections work proceeded only by hand. In order to appreciate the importance of what has been accomplished, it will be sufficient to show the tempo of subway building in some capitalist cities. Here are the figures received by me at Metrostroy. In Berlin, the first subway line, 11 kilometers long, of which more than half was not underground but elevated, took 6 years to build. The Gesandbrunnen-Neukölln line, 10 kilometers long, took about 6 years, from 1913 to 1930, with a break in the work from 1914 to 1926. The Alexanderplatz-Friedrichsfelde line, 7 kilometers long, took more than 4 years to build, from 1927 to 1931 inclusive. In Rome, the length of time required for the construction of 3 projected lines, extending 25 kilometers, is estimated as 12 years. In Prague, it is planned to build 3 lines extending over 21 kilometers to be finished by 1950. In Tokyo, 4 kilometers of line were built in 4 years. In New York, the rate is faster. The 8th Avenue subway line, 20 kilometers long, with double tunnels, was built in 7 years. In London, they built more slowly, but the last section, 10 kilometers long, where 21 shields were used, was built in 13 months. This also shows us that the way to build the second subway section is with shields rather than by hand. I do not cite this data in order to boast that we have surpassed the tempo of many capitalist cities. If under much more difficult conditions we have, in spite of a lack of experience and skill, surpassed the tempo of capitalist states, it is due to our system of economy, to the correct leadership of the party, of its Central Committee, and the enthusiasm of the wide masses of the workers. But at any rate, this comparison of the rate of the construction of the Moscow subway with those abroad does not give the representatives of capitalist culture grounds to put on airs and treat contemptuously the rate of construction of our subway. We know that there has been a lot of skepticism shown in bourgeois countries towards our subway, as in the case of many of our other big socialist constructions, as for example the Dnieperstroy. Even now, when we have already completed about 2/3 of all the work, there are people who will not believe that the subway will be in operation, and very soon at that. Well, we can only feel sorry for them. They will have to be disillusioned, as they have been on previous occasions. We willingly invite those people to come in a few months' time for a ride in our Soviet subway. But we, Bolsheviks, in summing up the total result of our work and laughing at the skeptics, will not become swell-headed. This is our way. This is what Lenin taught us and what Comrade Stalin is teaching us all the time. Boldly disclosing our shortcomings so as best to mobilize our forces to eliminate them, we will successfully complete the first section of the subway and begin work on the second. 2. Our task in the struggle for the completion of the subway and for a guarantee of high-quality work. We must not rest content with the work finished so far and the tempo we have reached. We are still faced with great and serious work. We still have sections which are lagging behind. Unless we take a series of special measures, these sections may lag behind half a year and even longer, and this would delay the opening of the subway. If we take the average figures, we find that up to date we have dug 11.4 kilometers of tunnels. That means that, with the exception of some small obstructions, it is now possible to walk under the earth through all the 11.9 kilometers of the first subway line. The bulk of concrete work, 68%, has been finished, the bare tunneling, 50%, completed roofs, 69%, walls, 74%, and invert, 37%. We have not yet done the bulk of the waterproofing and finishing work, nor have we begun the construction of the vestibules for the stations. These are the average figures, but we must not use these figures lightly to gloss over the conditions of separate sections. This is especially inadmissible in such an integrated system as the subway. If 11 kilometers of tunneling are ready, but in one section, as, for instance, from Dzerzhinsky Square to Sverdlov Square, there is no finished tunneling, if only for a few hundred or even a few dozen meters, then we cannot open the subway. One cannot do with a subway as is done in an animated cartoon film. A train comes along and all at once leaps over a number of obstacles. It is only on the screen where cars can jump over hills. Laughter and applause in the audience. We must expose all the difficult and backward sections of the work which threaten the fulfillment of our plan. There is first of all the shield section of the shaft number 12 on the theater way through which the river Neglinka flows. There, only 20% of the work of removing earth and pouring concrete has been done. We are not satisfied with the tempo reached, especially in a section where a Soviet shield is at work. For this section, we recently appointed a new chief by the name of Tyagni-Beda. Footnote: the name Tyagni-Beda is composed of two words, meaning pull out and trouble. End of footnote. The name suits this shaft, and Tyagni-Beda is pulling them out little by little. We are waiting for him to be fully worthy of his name. Laughter and applause in the audience. The cofferdam passage near Komsomol Square is the most difficult section of the work. It is hermetically sealed work, where water is forced out with the aid of compressed air, and where only exceptionally sturdy workers with strong hearts can work. Although the people working there apply themselves to the job self-sacrificingly and deserve praise, this group of cofferdam workers has removed only 58% of the earth and poured 49% of the concrete for the whole job. Hence, it is clear that the comrades, the cofferdam workers, must brace up. The most serious work, from the point of view of a delay in the opening of the subway, is presented in making the sloping entrances from the vestibules at the surface to the deep underground stations. This work is going on in 4 sections: the Myasnitsky, the Krasnye Voroda, the Dzerzhinsky Square, and in the Okhotny Row. There will be installed in these slopes electrically operated escalators carrying the passengers up and down between the underground station and the street. Here only 22% of the earth has been removed. If we do not make a decided improvement in the shortest possible time in this section, then a situation may be created where we will have the tunnel built, but we won't be able to reach the deep underground stations. With all the enthusiasm of the Muscovites and our love for the subway, is it certain that any of us will go down into the subway without a stairway? Laughter in the audience. A complicated section is the excavation work in the big station in Okhotny Row. There we have still to remove 43% of the earth and pour 36% of the concrete. But these operations can in no way compare in their significance and seriousness with those which we have already completed. We must neither exaggerate nor underestimate them. We are paying keener attention to them in order to complete them in time, and with more strenuous effort we will surely complete them. The quality of work. The question of the quality of work is the most important one in the construction of the subway. In fact, I would say the decisive one at the present moment. Right from the start of the construction, we put before ourselves the task of producing the best subway in the world. Some of the Metrostroy workers took this slogan in the wrong way, repeating it boastfully, but not fighting for quality in practice. Comrade Stalin, who generally likes all that is done to be done substantially and well, systematically called our attention to the question of quality in the construction of the subway. In all stages of the construction of the subway, quality of work is of the highest importance. However, the further the construction progresses, the more intricate and acute the question of quality becomes. When the earth is being excavated, the question of quality is chiefly a question of the productivity of labor, of net cost, a question of technique in work. But when we come to the concrete work, the waterproofing, finishing and assembly work, the installation of lights in the structure, the question of quality becomes more and more complicated and acute. Have all the workers of the subway, beginning with the directors and ending with the laborers, understood the importance of a day-to-day operative struggle for the quality of the subway? Permit me to declare that they have not understood it sufficiently. Do not look for contradictions between the statement on the heroes of labor, on remarkable people who have worked much and have accomplished a great deal, and the statement that the importance of quality has not been understood. This does not always depend upon the desires of a person, but depends on the approach, on the way in which one treats one's work. Today, the Moscow Soviet, the active workers of the factories, the active workers of Metrostroy, are in session. We are united, we are one family, but comrades, don't let this unity, our unanimity, lead to our neglecting self-criticism. Don't let it lead to the subway workers going away from here reassuredly saying, "We have been to the plenum, we have been praised, it means that everything is in order." The Moscow Soviet, the organ of authority which expresses the will of the workers and toilers of Moscow, demands of you, as the Central Committee of the party and the government demand of us, not simply to repeat the words about the world's best subway, but actually create it. Guarantee that this slogan should not be a boast, but that we in practice should show the whole world that we are capable of both setting the tempos and producing a high quality of work. We have not confined ourselves to a call for a struggle for quality. We have set up an expert commission into which we have drawn professors and the best specialists. This commission is constantly working, watching the quality of work. All the conclusions of our specialists, available up to date, show that there are no doubts concerning its durability. The subway is being built solidly, but we must certainly check up time and time again, so that if cases are found of defects in durability, they should be quickly rectified. The concrete work is being done, as a rule, solidly, but still slovenly with uneven surfaces, sometimes with holes and crusts. Comrade Kuratov, the plasterer of shaft number 12, who is working on the English Shield tunnel, writes me that the arches of the tunnel have an uneven surface, and therefore they must be either troweled or plastered more than is customary, which means that both time and cement are wasted. There is slovenliness in the work, and we must put up a stiff fight against it. More accuracy in the work. Imperfections must not be covered up, but must be rectified. We must put an end to supplying the shafts with inferior sand, rubble, gravel, roofing, rubberoid, and pergamene. Preliminary washing, grading, and proper preparation of the concrete must be brought up to the high standard demanded. The most burning question is that of waterproofing the tunnels. That is, the work of preventing the seepage of water in the tunnels, and this work is being done poorly. I could mention a whole list of shafts where the waterproofing work is being done carelessly. The details of the work are of great importance. How to lay out the rubberoid, how to join up the waterproofing sheets, to determine if waterproofing material has been broken or not, whether the ends are exposed or even neglected due to carelessness. There is nothing complicated in this operation, it is simple technical work. What is needed for people to reorganize their work? Very little is required of them. It is only necessary that the same attention be given to the quality of the waterproofing and finishing work as is given to the tempo, but this is not yet the case. The Moscow District and City Party Committee and the Moscow Soviet are systematically from day to day checking up the work of comrades Rodard, Abakumov, Starostin, Osipov, and of each director and party organizer of the shafts, demanding of them not words but deeds. The fight for quality must take on an operative character in all the sections. In every corner of the construction we must have a personal, vital interest in the work, but this personal, vital interest is just what is sometimes lacking. In the fight for quality, the administration of Metrostroy must not act by means of invocations, to issue an order, hold a meeting, and leave it at that. We must detect the unconscientious workers and catch them red-handed. We must not allow a single fact to pass us by. Each violation against the quality of the work must be rectified. We are building the subway not for a year, not for 5 years, but for a long period of time. The smallest error in construction will tell later on in the operation of the subway. The unconscientious workers must not think that if he puts plaster on, covers up bad work, adds the waterproofing, and then puts a layer of concrete over it, that no one will see the bad work. It will be much worse when it will be checked up in years to come, not by our commission but by time. Then the water will seep through and drip in the tunnel. Don't let the subway builders think that we are Ivans who forget their relations. At the end of the construction we will remember the builder who worked well, but we will remember also the one who built the tunnel badly. For those who underestimate this, the plenum of the Moscow Soviet must issue a warning that we will check up from day to day the quality of the work done by the directors of Metrostroy, the chiefs of the shafts and sections, the charge hands, brigadiers, and workers. We will check up on how they fight for the best quality of work in the subway. And as to those who are not worthy of confidence placed in them, those who do not want to produce work of high quality, the organs of authority will take all measures necessary. I hope that we will not have to take these measures. Thousands of directors, engineers, and fighters have grown up on the construction of the subway. The role of the comrades of the Young Communist League has been especially great. We came to know one another better in the period of constructing the subway. Together we have overcome many difficulties, eliminated many defects, and so together let us bring this undertaking to a victorious conclusion. Preparing to run the subway. We are still confronted by other intricate tasks. We must prepare for the running of the subway, train forces, complete a high-quality assembly, produce subway cars, escalators, build substations for power and assemble them, prepare repair shops, depots. Finally, we must build vestibules, do the finishing, and equip the stations. A high-quality subway means a good dry tunnel, a good track, comfortable and durable cars, a well-arranged electric traction system, well-designed and artistically finished stations and vestibules. All this must be done without any reservations or references to objective conditions. Our Soviet factories are producing the cars, motors, and escalators for the subway. Heavy industry is giving us every kind of assistance. Workers are present here from the Mitichi car building plant, from the dynamo plant, from the elevator construction works and other works. We hope that the workers attending the present conference, the representatives of these factories, and also the workers not represented here, the Yaroslav, Kharkov Electric Motor Works, Sormovo and others, will do everything possible to provide the subway with equipment on time and of a high quality. I must speak here especially of the role of the best plants of our union, the Leningrad plants Red Medalists, the Putilov, Izora, Elektrozilla and the others, which are producing for Metrostroy escalators, switches, accumulators, batteries, relays, which are being mastered in the USSR for the first time. The help given to the Moscow subway by the Leningrad Bolsheviks and workers will undoubtedly ensure our receiving the escalators on time, and of a quality not inferior to those of foreign make. The question of preparing to run the subway is exceptionally complicated. If the subway trains run at the same rate of speed as a tram car, if the subway trains stop because of breakdowns of the cars and in the electrical equipment of the track, or because of defective work in the stations, then the passengers, the Moscow workers, will give us no praise. The subway must differ from transport above ground by the fact that it runs a train at 3-minute intervals, so that anyone who rides underground does not have to wait for a train, but arrives quickly at his destination. If a Muscovite now spends from an hour to an hour and a half on a tram ride from Sokolniki to the Smolensk market, then with the subway he will make this journey in 1/2 or 1/3 of the time. The time saved will be available for cultural rest and work. Running the subway becomes a question, then, of creating more conveniences for a cultural life. If we don't prepare properly for the running of the subway, then we cannot have these conveniences. The second section of the subway. In the first section of the subway, which is nearing completion, we shall open the Sokolniki-Myasnitskaya line, the Frunze and Arbat line, which reach 2 parks of culture and rest, the Sokolniki and Gorky Central Park. We will link 3 railroad stations, the October, Northern and Kazan, the Krasnye and the Myasnitskye Vorodas, the Dzerzhinsky and Sverdlov squares, the Okotny Row, the Arbat, which means the most densely populated sections up to and including the Smolensk Square. In the next 4 years, we plan to build 20 kilometers more of new subway lines. So far, there has been no decision on the lines of the second section of the subway. Designs and plans are being prepared for the approval by the Central Committee of the party and the government. Comrade Stalin advised us to select the most congested routes, and above all, to cover the railroad stations, because hundreds of thousands of people are using them. Here are the routes of the new lines we are planning. 1. A new Gorky Street radius from Okotny Row to the White Russian Baltic Station, extending approximately 4 kilometers. A proposal was made to extend this line further to the Dynamo Stadium, but we have not the resources, and, besides, there is a fine wide road running there, the Leningrad Highway, beyond the White Russian Baltic Station. 2. A line from the Okotny Row to Paveletsk Station, which will intersect the Moscow River and run probably under it. 3. A line of 1.5 kilometers from Smolensk Square to the Bryansk Railroad Station, which, since the transfer of the capital of the Ukraine to Kiev, is a point of great traffic congestion. 4. A line linking the center with the congested Kursk Railroad Station, and a continuation of this line across the Stalin district to the Stalin Park and the International Stadium. The construction of the second section will cost less because we have already created a base for the production of the vital materials. We have houses, machines, and what is most important, we have experience. We will have to draw lessons from the construction of the first section to further mechanize our work. In London, they now build a subway almost entirely by the shield method using concrete blocks. You all probably have an idea of what a shield is. It is a big steel cylinder, the diameter of which is equal to the diameter of the tunnel, which supports the surrounding earth, and in moving forward sets concrete blocks in the passages it leaves behind it. The work is extraordinarily simplified, speeded up, and its cost greatly reduced. The second section of the subway must be built for the most part with shields rather than by hand. Fewer workers will be needed, the cost will be less. The basic cadres of Metrostroy will build the second section too. We must already select them so as not to lose the best people. Comrades of Metrostroy, you have a big task before you. All of you must answer to the party and to the working class for making the subway good and convenient in both sections, so that the passengers will always have a good word for your work. This will be the great reward for you from the Moscow proletariat and the Moscow Bolshevik Party organization. I am convinced that under the leadership of the Central Committee and Comrade Stalin, we will accomplish with honor the task of constructing a high-quality subway. 3. The plan of the city of Moscow. Allow me to dwell on the question of the plan of the city of Moscow, which is closely tied up with the construction of the subway. You all understand that the construction of the first section of the subway and the projected plan of the second section, to a great extent, predetermines the fate of the plan of the further development and construction of the city of Moscow. It is natural that each of you will rightly ask whether the routes of the subway were or are fixed fortuitously only in accordance with the present needs of the transportation of passengers, or if the plan of subway construction is brought into harmony with all the plans of further development and planning of Moscow. At the plenums of the Moscow Soviet and at the Moscow Party Conference, it was already reported that at the instructions of the Central Committee of the party, the government, the Moscow organizations, the Moscow Regional Committee, the Moscow City Committee, the Moscow Soviet, our planning and architectural institutions have been working in the course of the last 3 years on a general plan of the city of Moscow. In fixing the routes of the subway, we have taken into consideration the planning of Moscow. Recently, the Central Committee of the party and the government held an important conference in which the party and government leaders, the representatives of the Moscow organizations, and more than 50 architects and city designers who have been working on the rebuilding of our capital participated. At this conference, the plan of the city of Moscow, as proposed by the Moscow organizations, was taken up. Comrade Stalin gave us the essential and most important lines for the further development and planning of Moscow. Allow me, first of all, to explain the significance of the plan. Some people think that the planning of the city is a luxury, that it can be postponed for at least a few years. They ask us, have all the difficulties been overcome? Have all the specific problems of socialist construction been solved, that you have taken on the task of planning the city for 15 to 20 years in advance? These comrades make a great mistake. The art of our city building lies in the fact that we include the construction of each small section, each house, in the one single unified plan of the future city. In Moscow there are more than 2,500 streets and lanes, 51,000 dwellings, of which more than 31,000 are wooden ones, 23,000 one-story houses, and 21,000 two-story. I have said repeatedly that the proletariat had inherited in Moscow a most complicated system of labyrinths, winding lanes, blind alleys, the back streets, which had been the old Moscow of landlords and merchants. A street starts as a street, and unexpectedly in the middle of it stands an absurd house. It has occurred to some Tit-Titich to heap up his house just in the middle of the street, or to filch at least a good 5 to 10 meters for the wings of his mansion. Footnote: Tit-Titich is a type in a play by Ostrovsky denoting a merchant kulak. End of footnote. With the increase in population and the city growing to 5 millions, with the rapid growth in the number of automobiles and other means of city transport, it will be impossible to live in the city if we do not replan it, widen and straighten the streets, lay out new squares, etc. Of course, it will be necessary to straighten streets by removing useless one-story houses. At present, even in the central streets, as, for instance, in Gorky Street, we meet side by side with large beautiful buildings, miserable one-story wooden shacks, which disfigure the face of the proletarian capital. Similar ugly ancient structures deface the best places of our city, the quays of Moscow River. We are not indiscriminate in the tempos of demolishing the old buildings. We are not in a position to settle any great extent people from the demolished houses in a large part of the newly erected buildings, but a certain percentage of the newly erected buildings must be set aside for the accommodation of the people from the old houses. Unless this is done, Moscow will not be rebuilt, the streets will not be straightened. Where the widening and straightening of the streets is blocked by comparatively large and new buildings, these will have to be moved. Abroad, they have already accumulated a rich experience for moving comparatively large buildings distances of tens and even hundreds of meters. In rebuilding Moscow, we must look years ahead, otherwise we will be erecting a lot of buildings and structures of every sort in places where they should not be. If there is no plan of the city, we will be building such boxes as we will be ashamed even to look at in a few years' time. In some parts of Moscow, such boxes have already been built. Sometimes it even happens that a house is built just on a spot where a road must run or where a square must be laid out, and we in Moscow have too few squares. In recent years, we have started a great deal of construction in Moscow. Since 1926, we have erected about 3,500 new houses and additional stories to more than 300 buildings, with an aggregate floor space of more than 3,500,000 square meters. The year 1934 must add 655,000 square meters more of living space. In this same period, we have built 25 factory kitchens, a meat combinat, 12 mechanized bakeries, and a capacity of vegetable storage houses has been doubled from 105,000 tons in 1931 to 262,000 tons. 1.5 million square meters have been covered with improved pavements, 2 big waterworks have been built, and a dam at Rublevo with a hydroelectrical station. 717,000 trees and 3 million bushes have been planted, occupying an area of 90 hectares, etc. In the second 5-year plan period, we plan to build new living accommodations with an aggregate floor space of 4,500,000 square meters, out of which 1,300,000 square meters come under the years 1933 to 34. We plan to increase central municipal heating from a capacity of 207,000 kilowatts to 556,000. The improvement of roadways is planned to the extent of 2,700,000 square meters and 860,000 square meters of sidewalk. 70 new schools are to be built, 12 public bathhouses, 8 mechanized laundries. It is perfectly clear that we cannot proceed with such enormous outlays of capital unless we have a plan. At the conference, Comrade Stalin sharply raised the question of a decisive struggle against haphazard building. Individual builders, organizations and institutions build planlessly, spontaneously, and thus harm the city as a whole. We abolished private property in land long ago. However, even until today, we can observe the private property approach of individual builders towards the sections which have been placed at their disposal. We must fight decisively against such anti-state tendencies in the building of the city. We must build, said Comrade Stalin, according to a fixed plan. Anyone who tries to upset this plan must be called to order. A firm hand is necessary against anti-state tendencies. A firm and strong apparatus is needed, and firm discipline. The plan which defines exactly the line of the streets and squares must be an unalterable plan. We had lively discussions in elaborating upon the plan of reconstruction of Moscow. We started from the point of view of linking up the bold perspectives of the plan with the concrete realities of today. We cannot consider serious such plans of reconstructing Moscow as do not take into consideration the conditions of the city, which have resulted from its development in the historic past. I will not tell here in detail the history or give the essentials of the various plans. There were stingy proposals to leave the existing complicated system of small streets, lanes, and blind alleys as is, and to build only on the lots accidentally left vacant, on courtyards and the like. There were also plans which proposed to leave untouched the present Moscow with all its hovels, and to take the new construction far out of the city, 20 to 30 and even 70 to 100 kilometers out of present-day Moscow. In this, both the extreme lefts and the extreme rights sometimes agreed. There were more moderate ones who limited the plan to nothing more or less than a scheme for the removal of the government from the Kremlin into the Petrovsky Park. In our plan of Moscow, we rejected the extremes. Comrade Stalin, in remarking that the position taken by the Moscow organizations in the planning of Moscow was correct, pointed out that in reconstructing the city we must wage a struggle on two fronts. We cannot accept either the positions of those who deny the very principle of a city, who would have us leave Moscow a large village, or the position of the advocates of excessive urbanization, those who propose to build a city of the type of capitalist cities, with skyscrapers with an overcrowding of the population. History, said Comrade Stalin at the conference, shows us that the most economical type of distribution of population in industrial districts is the city, which affords economy in sewerage, waterworks, lighting, heating, and so on. Therefore, these people are wrong who propose to scatter the city another 70 to 100 kilometers, which means to transform it into a village, and deprive it of all advantages of municipal services and cultural city life. We must build at least 6 or 7-story buildings, and for some public institutions we may allow 15 and even 20 stories. In submitting our proposal for the plan of Moscow, we rejected these extremes, and we started out from the necessity of reconstructing the existing city with its buildings and other material wealth. We must not jib at our tasks, but in rebuilding and working on the existing streets, straightening and widening them, we must proceed to the construction of beautiful, convenient, large, well-designed buildings in the new districts before all the riversides and the districts where there are large parks. A most serious problem is the one of new territory for the city. We must extend the existing territory by not less than 50% of its present area. Where shall we carry the growth of the city? Some seek a solution of this problem only in the further encircling of Moscow, only with new rings around the Okrozhny Railroad. When we began working out the plan, we asked ourselves the question whether it were not possible to find new districts by starting out from the concrete conditions of our town. While the elaboration of the plan was still in progress, 2 years ago, Comrade Stalin put forward the idea of a wide use of the banks of the Moscow River. All who travel along these banks have noticed that the cultural center of the country has a riverside entirely neglected, impassable, uneven, and very poorly utilized. If there are buildings, then they are as a rule dwarfish and unattractive. The banks are not reinforced and they slide into the river. Within the city limits there are 25 kilometers of riverside, and counting both sides, 50 kilometers. This huge area is exceptionally favorable for building on. The river itself will be transformed as soon as we finish the Volga-Moscow Canal. The other rivers, as for example the Yauza, will also change. Canals will cut through the city along the extensive waterways, and thus created, Moscow will be developed still further. The importance of the Volga-Moscow Canal is enormous. This is an undertaking not smaller than Metrostroy. The canal will make Moscow a salubrious place, raise the level of the Moscow River by 3 meters, improve the 11 kilometers of the now sinking Yauza stream, make the whole length of the Moscow River and the Yauza navigable, provide Moscow with a sufficient quantity of water. The old Babyagorovsky Dam, which prevents navigation in the very center of the town, will be done away with. The water supply of Moscow will be doubled from 44 million vedros a day to 100 million vedros, and the average consumption of water per person will grow from 148 liters per day to 250 liters. Footnote: a vedro equals 2.70 gallons. End of footnote. We plan in the course of the next few years to build granite embankments all along the Moscow River and the Yauza to an extent of 50 kilometers. So far we have covered 2.3 kilometers, and in 1934 9 kilometers of granite embankments will be completed. Apart from the riverside, Comrade Stalin directs our attention to park development, by which he does not mean the little plots of grass about which our people are sometimes so enthusiastic, but large parks, which we must develop in every way in Moscow and its nearest suburbs. Some naive worker will think that if he has laid out a small lawn near the sidewalk, which, by the way, means narrowing the sidewalk, that this constitutes landscaping the city. But in reality, such a plot only cramps movement, and does not help in the slightest to ozonize the air. It is necessary to create large woodlands, parks, and wide boulevards. Side by side with construction on the riverside, the construction must be directed into the neighborhood of the Sokolniki, Izmailovo, Ostankino, and other parks. Since we have made the territory of the existing city the basis for the further construction of the city, the question arises sharply regarding the planning and improvement of the existing streets and squares. Here also there were different proposals. The question was debated as to which system of street arrangement is best, checkerboard or radial. But in this, some people forgot the historically formed network of streets, and in Moscow, as is known, the historically formed arrangement of the city is one of circles, which scheme in its own way is not a bad solution of the traffic problem. There may be different opinions as to which scheme is best, checkerboard or radial, but it is imperative and obligatory to reckon with the reality of the city as it actually stands. That is why we make it our task to perfect and improve the existing radial streets and circles. If you look at the map of Moscow, you will see first of all the Kremlin Circle, then the semicircle newly created along the line Kuznetsky Most, the Art Theater Way, Ogarev Street, the Bolshoi-Kislovsky Lane, the Krestovoshvishensky Lane, the Kremlin and Moskva-Reka quays. Today already we have positive results from this new semicircle. As soon as we paved the streets with asphalt, traffic here became brisker. Why should a chauffeur drive where it is congested when he can drive along this new semicircle? Then come the A and B circles. Beyond these circles are the Kamer, Kolesky Val, and the Okrosny Railroad. Thus we have a completed system of circles. Apart from the fact that street traffic is considerably facilitated, by this we bring into a definite system an enormous number of lanes and streets, in which not only the citizen of another city, but even the born and bred Muscovite is so apt to lose himself. The circular main lines are intersected by radial streets which converge into the center of the city and connect it with the districts. The main thoroughfares are as follows: Gorky Street to Leningrad Highway, Dimitrovka to Dimitrovka Highway, Neglinka to Ostankino, Dzerzhinsky Street to Yaroslav Highway, Yasnitskaya to Sokolniki, Pokrovka to Izmailovo Highway, Ulyanovskaya to Enthusiasts Highway, Solyanka to the Stalin Plant, Ordinka to Warsaw Highway, Yakimanka to Kaluga Highway, Kropotkin Street to Devichye Polye, Arbat to Mozaisk Highway, Herzen Street to Horoshevo Highway, etc. These are the starting and finishing points, but each of these main lines includes and joins together a series of streets. To these existing radial streets we must add a number of new streets, which it is imperative to lay out in those districts where the network of streets is insufficient. By bringing all the numerous streets into a single, well-proportioned system, after having widened and straightened them, we can have a well-proportioned system of 16 to 17 radial streets and 6 circles. At the present time, conditions are exceptionally favorable for us to create this system, to put it into shape and perfect it. If we delay for 5 or 6 years, we will have immeasurably greater expenditure of money and labor, and with less results, because we will have built where we should not have done so. To avoid this, we must determine the borders of expansion, the so-called red lines, so that in building we should not overstep these borders. Comrade Stalin directed special attention to the absolute necessity of widening the streets and squares of Moscow, and above all the main streets. With every year and even every month, the number of automobiles on the streets of Moscow increases. In a few years there will be scores of thousands of automobiles, and we must give serious thought to creating wide, good, well-constructed streets so as to facilitate traffic and reduce the number of victims of traffic accidents. Regarding the width of streets, Comrade Stalin pointed out that in the old section of the city, where widening the street necessitates demolishing old buildings, we may limit ourselves to 30 to 35 meters of width, but where we are laying out new streets, we should extend their width to 60 to 70 meters. The plan of the city, apart from the straightening and widening of the streets of Moscow, provides for the creation of squares artistically laid out at the intersections of the radial streets and circular main lines. For the convenience of traffic in the center, and to allow great numbers of people to pass through, there is being created a wide avenue from Nogin Square to Dzerzhinsky Square as a result of raising the Chinese Wall, and over the Okhotny Row along the widened Mokovaya and Volkhonka streets to the Palace of Soviets and ending at the Krim Square. On the Mokovaya, opposite the university, work of demolishing buildings and widening the street to the width of the Okhotny Row will be continued. We believe that in the future the whole block will have to be demolished in order to afford a clearer view to the facade of the Hotel of the Moscow Soviet. A further perspective we have in mind is the demolition also of the block between the Mokovaya-Manes Square and the Zapozhovsky Square, right up to the Palace of Soviets, so as to lay out in front of it an enormous square reaching to Frunze Street. The streams of traffic converging into the center through the radial streets will flow freely about this central avenue. A supplementary route as an outlet from the center of the city will be, as I have already mentioned, the semicircle along Kuznetsky Most, the Art Theater Way, Ogarev Street, and so on, with an egress onto the quay of the Moscow River. The opposite side of this prospect, across the Moscow River, the Sofia, Bersenev, and Krim quays, now occupied entirely by small houses, will be decorated by large monumental buildings for homes and public institutions. Concretely, as a phase of this work, we will start next year the construction of a gigantic 15 to 20-story house and hotel of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR on the Sofia Quay. These new buildings on the banks of the river and the deepened Moscow River, navigable along its entire course, will furnish, one might say, a background against which will stand out prominently the grandiose achievement in modern building and architecture, the Palace of Soviets. Kitai-Gorod will be entirely rebuilt. Footnote: Kitai-Gorod means the Chinese city. End of footnote. A start has already been made in clearing away a section from the erection of the House of Industry on the territory between Veloshny and Bluchner Lane, the Ilyanka and Sverdlov Square. The Red Square is acutely in need of being widened. Later on we will have to demolish the GUM building, which limits the dimensions of the Red Square. Then the facade of the House of Industry will directly overlook the Red Square in addition to the Ilyanka Street and Sverdlov Square, and we will thus beautify the best parts of the city. The rebuilding of Kitai-Gorod will be accomplished by the demolition of the Zaryadye, which is absolutely crammed full of insanitary, chaotically distributed buildings. Over the site of Zaryadye, beginning from the Varvarka, there will be built a stepstone terrace descending towards the Moscow River. In the struggle for New Moscow, a very important question is that of the beauty of the constructions, of the architectural designing of buildings, and of accommodation and conveniences. In the last years, our architectural work has been improving, although still insufficiently. Particularly acute is the question of highly qualified builders and of building materials of a high quality. However, we are confident that we will solve this problem. We are learning and will continue learning how to erect buildings which are good in every respect. Our architects already play and will continue to play a big role in the reconstruction of the city. We have reorganized our architectural and planning work. The architects have united in the architectural studies of the Moscow Soviet under the direction of leading architects. We are certain that in conditions where architecture is given such attention by the party and by Comrade Stalin personally, the creative art work of the architects can and must develop more widely and deeply. The Central Committee and the government have approved in the main the general plan presented by the Moscow Regional Party Committee, the Moscow City Party Committee, and the Moscow Soviet, and have commissioned us to work out concrete practical proposals and submit them for approval to the Central Committee and the government. We have already started to elaborate these proposals. We, of course, understand that the most difficult task, the realization of the plan, still lies ahead of us. We know we must regulate the tempos of the general reconstruction of Moscow with actual possibilities. The fulfillment of the general plan of reconstruction of Moscow entails an enormous expenditure of resources. We must not imagine that we can accomplish it in 1 or 2 years. Moscow took about 800 years to be built. It was built chaotically, and it will take us years and years of stubborn and persistent work to rebuild it. Current tasks. In building the subway, the canal, in putting before us the main tasks of our plan, we must not for the sake of big things forget the so-called small ones, the questions of improvements of the present municipal services of the Moscow population. Indeed, these are not small, they are big matters, which determine the moods and conditions of life today. We must keep in mind the needs of the population each day and not neglect our current tasks because we are taken up with big constructions. For example, it would be very bad if, having completed the subway by the scheduled time, we should forget to supply fuel on time in sufficient quantity to the population of Moscow. Current problems of city management are particularly acute inasmuch as the construction of the subway has to some extent upset the normal life of the city, especially in the Sokolniki and Ostazenka districts, where the work is being done in an open cut. Simultaneously with the completion of the construction of the tunnels in the separate sections, we set ourselves the task of speedily removing from the streets the head frames of the subway, footnote, the shaft towers, end of footnote, and leveling off the surfaces, paving the streets and repairing the buildings. We have provided in the approved plan of work that the demolition of the head frames from Sokolniki to the Komsomol Square, inclusive, be effected in the period from July 15th to October 25th, so that the main streets will be fully repaired and paved by November 1st. It is planned to repair a large part of Ostazenka by October 15th and Myasnitsky Street by November 1st. In our preparations for this, we have taken steps to complete the finishing of the new buildings now under construction on the main streets, as for example the Hotel of the Moscow Soviet in the Okhotny Row and the building of the former Moscow Municipal Services Administration on Theater Way. We are widening the passable part of Moskovaya Street from Gorky Street to Manez Square and so on. In connection with the demolition of the Sukharev Tower, we are reconstructing, landscaping and finishing the Sukharev Square. We are creating a wide avenue from Sverdlov Square to Nogin Square by raising the Chinese city wall. All this will considerably improve the appearance and form of the central streets of the city. As the construction of the subway progresses, our plan calls for a gradual change also in the character of surface transport. Comrade Stalin, in his speech, approved our plans gradually to remove tramcars which are overburdening the streets, retarding traffic and creating an incredible noise from the over-congested streets in the center to the outlying areas, and to replace them, apart from the new subway lines, with a more noiseless and flexible means of transport, as for example the Autobus and particularly the trolleybus, which has justified itself in every way. We have made the first experiment by removing the tramway from the Arbat. It should be noted that this has greatly improved the street, the traffic congestion has been sharply reduced, and the street itself has changed its appearance. While we are improving and beautifying the central streets of the city, we must not neglect the outlying districts, the bad streets and dirty courtyards. We should be ashamed of those insanitary corners that we have still been unable to eliminate, the remains of old, unkempt Moscow. In rebuilding Moscow, we must work obstinately and persistently for years, not only on the construction of the new, but also on the reconstruction of the old. The Bureau of the Moscow Regional and City Committees of the Party and the Presidium of the Moscow Soviet deemed it the most important economic and political task in line with the beautifying, improving and cleaning up of the whole network of central streets, to introduce a minimum of order into the rest of the streets of Moscow, After eliminating the unendurable insanitary condition of the separate lanes, blind alleys, courtyards, old buildings, to repair the half-crumbled buildings which can be restored, to rid the city of the hastily knocked-together shanties which still stand in some parts of the city. The Presidium of the Moscow Soviet and the Bureau of the City Committee of the Party, the district party committees, have undertaken this work. The closest assistants in carrying out their instructions are the district Soviets. However, we must say frankly that the district Soviets are still working poorly on the improvement of their districts. They still do not show and do not feel themselves that they are the masters of their districts in the full sense of the word. A most important task is to bring the district Soviets closer to the masses of the population which they serve. In every corner of the district there must be a master who would know all the needs of the district and to make them his daily concern. There should be a master who pays attention to the good order of his street and house. There should be a master who, loving his section, his street, would make it his concern to fight against hooliganism, bad house management, untidiness, and lack of culture. If the Moscow Soviet and the district Soviets are to begin this big undertaking, it is apparent that sub-district Soviets must be created. The districts containing up to 400,000 population are too big. Each district is a whole large city in itself. It is hard to cover and keep account of the needs of such a big district from one center. If there are sub-district Soviets covering several streets, if the Soviet deputies and the Soviet section leaders work actively in the sub-district Soviets, becoming fighters for their street, their sidewalk, their court, the improvement of Moscow will go on apace. The successful reconstruction of Moscow demands that each citizen, each worker, each city inhabitant and social activist should love the street in which he lives, should work unceasingly to create cultural conditions in his house, court, lane and street, and the place bordering upon them, the squares and parks. Comrades, Moscow is attracting the attention not only of our country, but of all the world too. The subway is a concentrated expression of the attention, that love which the working class and collective farm peasantry show for the reconstruction of our great socialist capital. The Central Committee of the Party and the government, at the initiative of Comrade Stalin, at a time when the strengthening of our defense and the realization of the great tasks of socialist construction in the fields of industry and agriculture demand enormous resources, have nevertheless appropriated out of the state budget funds for building the subway, the Volga-Moscow Canal, granite embankments on the Moscow River. We Muscovites must justify through our work, our energy, our efforts, that confidence and support which the party and the government have shown us. Today, in discussing the question of the subway and the reconstruction of Moscow, we activists, the leaders of the city of Moscow, will say to the party, to our Central Committee and the government, we will say to Comrade Stalin, we will be worthy of that confidence and that support which you have shown us. We will work unceasingly under your leadership, Comrade Stalin, so as to make Moscow the model socialist city of our proletarian state. Long live the new Moscow, the capital of the great Soviet Union of Socialist Republics. Stormy applause in the audience. Long live the working class of Moscow and of all the Union. Long live the great army of shock brigaders, among them the shock brigade builders of the subway. Stormy applause in the audience. Long live our great mighty party, our great and mighty friend, leader and organizer, Comrade Stalin. Thunderous applause, cries of hurrah, all stand cheering.